Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to be going over. So I went over the true dichotomies and the first three fundamental true dichotomies. I've gone over tier 0, I've gone over tier 1, and now I'm going to go over tier 2 all the way up through tier 10. And I think I could do that in one video because there's not too much really to say about all the tiers other than what happens at each tier, like the meaning of each tier. Because we are, like, scientifically, we understand how we've been studying how each tier works, and I'm not on the forefront of a lot of these. I'm not studying quantum physics. I'm not studying subatomic particles and atomic particles. I'm not studying all these things specifically. All I've done is create a framework that gets you to understand the pattern that's happening throughout the universe. So we're going through tiers as we go through the universe. So, like, when it comes to quarks are the fundamental first mass. Quarks and leptons are the first things with mass. They're the first matter in the universe. So the components of tier 2 are quarks, leptons, and bosons. So there's really 3 fundamental particles or distinct things that are created as a result of the nascent universe coming into existence. And the quarks come in 6 types or flavors: up, down, charm, strange, top, and bottom. And they combine to form protons and neutrons. So you can kind of think of them as they're all the same thing and just different, bent in different ways or different shapes to get them to create these 2 types of particles. So they create protons and neutrons. Well, then you have leptons. Leptons are more or less some of the things that are some of the fundamental building blocks. It's like some of them are the glue. Some of them act as light, electromagnetic forces, etc. So leptons are more or less all the particles, the wave particle duality type interactions, and the fundamental forces. Whereas quarks become protons and neutrons. And how it works more or less is that quarks combine together in various ways to create protons and neutrons. I'm not sure about the specifics of what needs to happen in order for that to take place, but that's what's happening. Now, I don't know the process, but I know that's what happens. Quarks come together, they form protons and neutrons. It's pretty simple to get. You don't have to know the math underneath that to know that's what's happening. And then we continue. But at this level of analysis, there's a bunch of new true dichotomies that form as a result, because right now, our current thoughts are that gravity comes into existence at this tier. So, and I forgot which particle it is, but I know there's gravitons is a particle. It's a theoretical thing that people have come up with, but I think they might be as a fundamental result of these particles manifesting. They create gravity and they create this relationship throughout the universe with everything. And so each tier, as you go all the way up the tiers, it manifests more and more infinite complexity. So it's like exponential complexity, I would say, not infinite, because obviously there's only so many things you could do with quarks alone. But as you keep going up tiers, like, we're now at the level where we're getting close to being able to manipulate many different tiers. And an example of that is like our ability, like, I'm digressing a little bit here, but our ability to utilize biological, biotechnology to manipulate DNA, either germline editing or in bacteria, in all these different kinds of beings or tiers, as you could say. Like, we can manipulate their DNA and to suit our needs. But we have to make sure that it's in pursuit or in service of our right hemisphere and our relationship to everyone else in beings. But we also need to fully understand it before we integrate it fully. So an example is obviously just bioengineering. Like, we need to be very careful, because if we change the genome of an entire thing, it's going to cascade all the way across the universe. Like, it sounds weird, but at least on Earth, it's gonna completely change the face of the Earth to where we might not be able to understand what changes we're making that are so fundamental to the balance of life. And for example, like life has been trying to figure out how to make sure it maintains balance. And like you can think of life as a being itself, because if you like, not only do you have a relationship as an individual being within this universe to everything around you, but if every other life form dies, you die. There is no life. Like we rely on plants or animals. If those two things die, we don't exist anymore. So we have to maintain the balance or order within our planet to maintain that. And if we don't, then we all die, unless we're deciding to eat each other or we decide to completely like manufacture our own. But yeah, so you kind of get the idea though. So you have strong force, magnetic force, weak force, gravitational force. All these forces are fundamentally true dichotomies. And because you can't have none of them and you can't have absolute of them. So everything has these forces. So you guys can look that up yourself if you want to, but our bodies have integrated these forces within each one of the forces are integrated in us. So we have all these true dichotomies in us as well. Whether or not they're useful for utility is yet to be seen. Like whether or not we can manipulate these at the level of our bodies is, I mean, we can obviously, do transcranial magnetic imaging and stuff like that, but I'm talking about actually manipulating them to change their state. So like turning atoms into gold, like stuff like that. So not necessarily whether or not we can influence these per se, but to what degree and at which tier can we influence them. So that's kind of how you think about it, or at least I think about it. So there's a lot more to this, and ChatGPT has helped me with a lot of this. I'm not going to lie about that, because I'm not super well versed in particle physics or like subatomic particles and like quarks, leptons, and bosons, like that stuff. What I'm trying to elaborate on is the synthesis tier and the true dichotomies that manifest as a result. So a lot of this other information is just stuff that is in addition, and some of it might be wrong, but as I build this out, then I'm going to refine it. So I'm not even done with this book, but I'm sharing with you guys along this journey with me to try to, if you guys want to help me, like I want help from people. I want your guys' knowledge and input. Like I want to see where this is wrong and where it's right, so that I can like create something that I don't necessarily want to be my own. I want it to be everyone's. I want us to all chip in on this. I want it to be a free-flowing document that people can add, make additions to, take away from, and we can all contribute. And I think that's what's going to make it the most powerful, is like if we put all of the brain power in the United States, but the whole world together, we can create something that will make sense. And I'm not saying like it's going to be like completely anybody's allowed to make these decisions. It has to be well established. There has to be both scientific evidence and a religious meaning and value to what we add. So if both are not incorporated in something that is spoken or said or tried to change, then like the scientific community and the religious community have to come together to agree that this is the case. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's like if I can get somebody who's religious to also agree to this, and someone who's pure scientist who doesn't have any religious background or anything like that to agree to this, then we know we're on the right track. And that's all I want to do, because any of the extra stuff that is very in contention is likely just another true dichotomy that they're arguing about. It's kind of like, what's more important, control or freedom? Well, if you're just going to sit there and argue that control is more important in this particular situation, all you're arguing for is the underlying true dichotomy, or where you think it should be. Like where along that spectrum do you think our amount of control should be over people? And that's what people are fundamentally quibbling about. When in reality, if you look at the big picture, what matters is trying to figure this stuff out together. Like there has to be something true in what everybody is saying. If there's so many people saying it, there has to be some truth in it. So we just got to figure out what that is. So that's more or less quarks, and there's more to it. Like I said, you guys can go through that. Quarks, again, quarks and leptons and bosons, they combine together in various ways to manifest other things in our universe. And one example of that is protons and neutrons. And this is going to be the shortest tier because it's literally, I don't have a way to elaborate on yet what else manifests as a result of just protons and neutrons existing, other than they're free-floating particles until they bump into certain things in a certain way, and then they manifest atoms. And obviously a lot of it happens in supernova. So supernovae are responsible for the majority of the atoms that have been synthesized. So when a supernova happens, boom, so like this is where the supernovas happen. Like these just kind of free float, and then boom, supernova create all these atoms, and the atoms combine in various ways, and then they synthesize and they create a whole new spectrum of things that are possible in the universe at every level, because they all interact in various ways too that wasn't possible before. And then so they interact with each other within the tiers. They interact at a lower level between the electrons and protons in the universe, and then they react up a level, which is to say that atoms interact with molecules. So when atoms meet molecules, they interact in a particular way, and obviously it's a much less, like, it's almost like a fly landing on you versus another whole molecule affecting you in a way. So, but I mean, obviously some molecules can be completely broken down by atoms. So it depends on what the interaction is, whether or not it's going to be exothermic or endothermic. So it's going to be a synthesis, which is endothermic, or if it's going to be exothermic, which is entropy, or a division, or separation, or like however you want to visualize it. But so these are a lot of the things that manifest as a result. And then you get the next tier. So multiple atoms combine together in various ways to make molecules. Now a molecule can be the same. Sorry, let me go back to atoms one more time. So I don't know if I addressed this, but it's fundamentally interesting that atoms are created from a tier 2 and tier 3 synthesis. So they're using electrons, which are a result of, I believe, bosons. So electrons are manifest. So they manifest as a result of that. And so the atoms come together, they create molecules. But the atoms are formed from electrons, which is a different whole tier. So their tiers can interact with each other to create a whole nother tier. And that's what we have to make sure we keep in mind for future use and future understanding, is that not only can things within a tier create the next tier, but also combining things within this tier and the other tiers create a new tier. So we have to figure out how we can combine things in different ways as we can manipulate, you could say, or change more of the way the world works. But we have to be careful what we do. And we have to make sure it's in service to our right hemisphere and our relationship to everything. And that's the main thing that we have to think about along the way. It's like not necessarily for the sake of our own pleasure, our own satisfaction. It's for the sake of this higher function that we all agree on as a society. It's like we have to agree on it. If we don't all agree, like not 100% agree, but if the majority, if people intuitions are telling them that it's fine, and the scientific evidence shows that we have the knowledge, we have the capability, we have, if anything goes wrong, we have a emergency escape hatch that is prepared, especially when it comes to like integrating AI, changing our biology, etc. Like make sure we keep track of what DNA germlines that we edit, because fundamentally changing some of this will have cascading ripple effects. Like imagine if you create a single-celled organism that no longer has the self-destruct gene when it becomes too overbearing for the world And that's what happens a lot of times. Like they have self-destruct genes, and it's weird that our genes have those, but it's for the sake of the survival of the whole. Obviously, part of it is that, but also part of it is because it has to know when it's affecting the whole. So if you think of all of life as one whole being, if one life form is trying to take over everything and it ends up doing it, then it dies because there's nothing else for it to eat except for its own kind. And obviously evolution has selected against that. So all of life, if that life form loses its food source, everything dies. So there is no life anymore, and it has to start over from scratch. And I think that's probably happened a couple times with proto-life. So proto-life started into prokaryotes. Prokaryotes gobbled up everything probably multiple times before they actually not understood. They didn't think about it consciously. But it changed in a way, either randomly or if there is consciousness manifested just in reality, nascent reality itself, which is I don't rule that out, but there's not enough evidence or understanding of what that even means or how it can mean anything. But if there is, then you just think of life as a conscious being, and it's much easier to detail out why it would want to do this. Like it wants to survive and thrive, so it needs to maintain balance within its own self as an organism. So it's going to diversify in many different branching elements that are all maintaining balance for certain things, taking different things into account. So for example, when you have too much, let's say, algae, like an algae can take over the planet and cause too much oxygen to be released into the atmosphere. Well, what's a good mechanism to prevent that? Well, you need more animals on land that will be able to absorb a lot of that oxygen. So between us and animals, we absorb a lot of oxygen and they absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, and we exchange that. It's almost like a breath, that the earth is taking a breath back and forth with life is. So life takes a breath back and forth between carbon dioxide and oxygen, and it's breathing with the animals. So it's breathing, humans, all the animals are breathing out carbon dioxide, and it just makes sense intuitively this way, even if you don't believe that it's an actual being, right? It doesn't. This is what's happening. Like, it's an easier way to understand it because it's simplified. And if you think of, that's why all of the religious texts are so simplified. It's supposed to elicit that understanding that's simple and that you can relate to without having to go too deep or abstract or complex with the understanding. So I've covered a lot right there and I kind of want to get on that later when we start getting into prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and multicellular organisms. But I really do, I believe that there's some kind of balance that life necessitates life. Whether you think it's necessitated by it, whatever the case may be, this is something that's manifesting in reality. If it's deterministic, whatever the case may be, it's happening. So life is finding a way, whether it's random or it's selecting, it's found a pattern to figure out which genes would take care of the current problem. And obviously we're so complex as beings that we kind of don't even know where a lot of our thoughts come from. Sometimes they just come out of nowhere. And it's really weird. Like, an example of that's like, not epiphanies, but what are when you think you saw the future, but you didn't see the future. It's like your brain misattributes something to the past or something like that. And then you just view it as if it is the past. But I'll remember it later probably. But it's just interesting that those kind of things happen to us. But people could draw false connections and say that is us being able to connect with our consciousness and predict the future. But at the same time, it's like, well, if you don't believe that the future can be predicted necessarily, then maybe you're seeing something of, I don't know. regardless, that's kind of like the whole or like not conspiracy theorist, but drawing too many connections, and it's not yet. So, like I've said before, it has to be there has to be evidence, or it has to be. We want it to come from science and religion and meet together. It doesn't have to be just one for the other. It's just that, for example, if a certain set of beliefs, no matter how crazy they are, lead to a better outcome, then it could be the better belief, or it's almost guaranteed to be the case to be a better outcome if it leads to a better outcome. So if the society is more stable across time, less people are at odds with each other, there's less death, but at the same time there's more freedom. So it's like maximizing the opposites. And that's what we're trying to do, and that's what equilibrium is about. It's like if you maximize all of the opposites, it's impossible to go wrong. Because if you have control and freedom and you try to maximize both, then you have elements that do have control and make sure people are doing what they're supposed to, but you have elements of as many elements as possible of freedom to make sure people have the freedom of choice and of thought and of movement and everything. So you want to maximize both, but in doing so, you have to compromise and make trade-offs, and that's what compromise is supposed to be about throughout this entire thing. It's like it happens at the level of humanity, but at every tier it happens. You could say the compromise is the equilibrium, and it happens naturally in every other tier, but within humans it does not happen naturally. We have to actually think it through. Like we are thinking creatures, and it's complicated and it's infinite. So we have to find within this infinite spectrum of things what we should do. Okay, so we are at the tier of molecules, and molecules are really complex, and they just get more and more complex, obviously, as you go on. You could have, I don't even know how many combinations of molecules there could possibly be in the universe, but it's probably approaching like quadrillions, if not more. So it gets insane. And then proto-life is this whole nother set of, it's like, I'm not sure about this yet, but that's why I haven't written anything down either yet. But I think there may have been, or there likely is, something between prokaryotes and molecules that had to exist before prokaryotes. I'm not sure what that is. It may have been just the genes on their own, like floating around, and then they combined with like AC and TG or whatever, I forgot what they are, but they combine together and they create a chain. So like they were probably just floating around, and then one of them eventually just synthesized, and then it created a chain, and then that chain somehow led to its success more often, but I don't know how that is. So this is something that's like the biggest mystery, I think, in the universe right now, is like how did you get from molecules to prokaryotes? And I think there's something missing. And obviously at this level of analysis, there's no fossils. There's almost no evidence at all for anything, even at the level of prokaryotes. So it's very difficult to even study this and to understand what can happen. All we can do is recreate simulations or create an environment that is similar to what the early Earth looked like or was like, and then try to manufacture how it would possibly happen. So that's how prokaryotes would come about. And then eukaryotes. So eukaryotes are single cell organisms still, but they're a different kind. So some of the theories around them are that the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, and some other prokaryote combined or merged and created eukaryotes. So this is another synthesis. It's a merging of the two. Now it doesn't necessitate within my framework that these things are true. Like each one of these tiers can or cannot exist depending on how we think about it. But I'm just telling you what I think to be most likely to be the case. And I think it's most likely that prokaryotes did combine to make a eukaryote, because I don't see how you can get a prokaryote that just automatically becomes a eukaryote. I don't see how that that could be the case. So there had to be a chain there. And I think that is the chain. And that complexity added even more complexity, because if you have a powerhouse and you have, let's say, a nucleus or a control house, you would need one, because now you have two things working together. Now you need something that fundamentally unites them all, like something that holds them together, and then a way to communicate that, a way to replicate both of you at the same time. So you need a central hub to make sure that that happens, which is why viruses really don't need that. They're either part of, like, I think viruses might even be their own step, but they might also, I would have to think more on that. But viruses are very interesting. And like, they might have been prokaryotes that devolved, and like they're like, I don't need all this excess baggage, and they just ditched all the extra stuff. Like, it might have gotten to that point, and then they devolved a little bit or went reverse, because we could very well do that. Like, us as a species could divide to where the point where humans are completely separate, and we evolve slowly to live that kind of life. So it is a possibility, but it would be a very weird context in which that would happen. So eukaryotes, don't have much to say about them. They have all this crazy stuff that manifests as a result of their synthesis. All kinds of new true dichotomies, like metabolism. I guess cells have, like, those other cells have metabolism too, but just all kinds of stuff, like a central power or a centralized thing that keeps things together. But so then you move on to tier 9, which is a synthesis into multicellular life. So you have multiple eukaryotes, that combine together to make multicellular life. And obviously this happened over time. Like, it wasn't a rabbit that just popped up. It started from the bottom, like a ground up. Like, two cells came together and like, hey, we just made, we just came together, and our survival was benefited as a result. So whatever that would look like, when two cells work together in unison, they realize that in working together, they can achieve so much more. Like, let's say a cell is eating the other cell, and this other cell's like, nah, that's my buddy, and it eats it with him. So they both are eating this same cell, but they recognize they don't want to eat each other, so then they just devour half each. So in doing that, they achieve a synthesis. So they are synthesized, like just a 2-cell being. And you could say it's multicellular life. I don't know of any examples of it, just a 2-cell life, but I think this is a stage. And I think at each level, as the tier manifested, and I think this happened at the level of proto-life, I think prokaryotes just devoured, and even eukaryotes just devoured every proto-life that existed, and he just used it as a fuel source. It's like, this stuff's so easy to just destroy. It has no other mechanisms to defend itself. It has no centralized hub to navigate the world at all. So as prokaryotes and eukaryotes developed and became stronger, smarter, you could say smarter, but better developed and suited to take on these challenges, they just devoured everything. So there's nothing left for us to observe. There's no proto-life there anymore because it's all gone. But that happens at multiple stages. So when it comes to the level of a multicellular being, as it gets larger and larger, it starts separating itself from that lower stage of just single cellular organisms. And in doing so, but it's also gobbling up everything else around it that's trying to also manifest as a multicellular being. So I think there's another boundary there. Like, if something evolves this way and is continuing to devour, there's almost like a barrier there, like a separated barrier that says, as soon as you become a multicellular organism, you're either eaten, because like it's just like, I think there's a barrier. Like, as soon as it happens, then there's no way for it to happen again. And I think that that's happened multiple times. Like there's no way for new life to form unless it was completely separated from the earth. And I don't think that can happen because our life is so good and so already not good, but it's so well adapted to just consuming and but also maintaining balance that it's an ongoing battle forever. And we're always going to be at odds with diseases, bacteria, all these prokaryotes, and even some eukaryotes, and then viruses. So we're always going to be at odds with them, and it's going to be it'll be impossible to rid them because some live within us, some are part of our nature, some are like good luck getting rid of all of them. But the point would be that there's a barrier, and there's likely a barrier between molecules and prokaryotes. And there's likely a barrier between eukaryotes and multicellular life. And I don't know if there's any evidence. I can look this up after this actually and see if there's evidence that there are multicellular organisms that are just 2 cells or like the minimum number of cells. But I do think there's a barrier there, just intuitively. But I would have to research that. So tier 10 synthesis. So tier 9, it's pretty simple. You just eventually get, it's complicated. It's really complicated, but it's, right now I'm just going to address that it is just multicellular organisms, and they manifest so many different things, like hair, and like all these, well, obviously I think there's phalanges, but I don't know if you'd call that a hair. But they manifest all these new characteristics. Perception. So perception is incredible. It is the basis for our ability to interpret reality. And that's developed at the stage of a multicellular organism. But then we get into tier 10, which is when things get really complex. And the meaning of an association with it is like this is when religion and science and manipulating the world is possible. So a multicellular life on its own cannot create a society, and that means it cannot have distribution of labor. It can't have division of labor. It can't have specializations in particular fields of study. So it cannot possibly multicellular life on its own without it being a social life and obviously having some physical ability to manipulate the world and all the perceptions we have. But if it doesn't have social life, then it cannot possibly reach the next tier. So that's why social life is its own, in that we are combining multiple people that are unrelated, but we can still breed with each other. But the point is we're unrelated and we're using them in a cohesive whole. This is almost unprecedented anywhere in the animal kingdom, that unrelated beings can work together in a cooperative way without tearing each other apart. And we do that through our meaning and relationship with reality itself. And we have to come up with ideas, concepts, and ways of thinking about that continue that process. And that's what we need to be aiming at, because obviously what happens if you're not aiming at that? What happens if you're not aiming at bringing people together? What happens if you're not aiming at creating the next synthesis tier? You're going to start destroying things. You're going to start not wanting to cooperate, and you're going to start heading down the synthesis tiers. So if we don't want to cooperate, if we don't want to try to find a way to bring us all together, and we always want to be at odds, eventually people are going to hate each other and kill each other, and that's not good. But I think we're on the right track to understanding that communication of our ideas is really what we need to do, and we need to show people the truth. And we can only do that through discussion, inquiry, and all these other things. So these are the 10 synthesis tiers that currently exist. As far as I know, there might be more. There might be less. They're not a fixed number. It's not a God-sent number or anything like that. It's just, this is what I observe, because these are the characteristics of a synthesis. It's just two things combining to make a new thing with its own characteristics. So there's tiers of synthesis, but we can also have synthesis within our society. So an example would be a phone, an iPhone, a smartphone, a car, all the things that we can rationalize and synthesize around us. And we can create our own syntheses through manipulation of our abilities. So I truly believe that synthesis is Lucifer in service of God. And this is where I might lose a lot of the scientific individuals. But if you were to think of your left hemisphere as Lucifer, it is of the realm of manipulation. It's of the realm of rationalization, science. It's of logic, reasoning. And obviously the right hemisphere is involved to some degree. But primarily the thing that's attributing or contributing to this ability in reading and writing and articulation, all these things are being contributed by the left hemisphere. And what does the Bible associate with Lucifer? It's the light bringer. It's the person. It's the thing that makes you feel enlightened. It makes you feel like you have answers to everything. When in reality, you can never have perfect answers. And I don't think this is a perfect book. I don't think the Quran's a perfect book. I don't think the Bible's a perfect book. But there's things that are closer to the truth. And I think the Bible gets close to the truth in a lot of ways, but misses the truth in other ways. And it's hard to reconcile because the things that people truly believe based on the evidence around them and the epiphanies that they have, there's some truth in it. No matter what you do, there's some element of truth. So it's okay, well then how do you decide which one is true and which one's not? It can't just be perfectly based in science. It has to have you have to have perfect intuition and perfect science, which are both impossible. So you can't have a perfect book of science. You can't have a perfect understanding of science, but you can't have a perfect understanding of religion or spirituality or anything like that either. And that's just because of the nature of true dichotomies. So you can't have any of those things. And all these ideas, concepts, and everything manifest at this level of tier 10. And that's why our societies are so complex and so fragile, is because when you add complexity, you added instability. So we have to become more stable creatures, which is why our brains kind of shrunk over the past couple hundred years. We had to become more stable and concrete and specific in our thinking in a certain way so that we can all get along and cooperate. And it's obviously, there's other things at play with the shrinking of our brain, but that's one of them. And another one is that, what was it? So that it's just refinement. So our brains are becoming more refined. So it's kind of like the evolutionary arms race blew up our brain, and then the process kind of reduced it to the necessary components. It's just like when we synthesize anything that's new. So when we synthesize, let's say, a car, the first car ever made was a hunk in a heap, and it was just so much complexity, so many extra parts. But then as people reduced it and refined it, eventually we got the Model T. And then that's when it was ready for the consumer in the market. So it's much like that. It's like our brains are getting closer and closer to be ready for our market, which is the universe, understanding and articulating the universe. And we're slowly getting there. And I think as we refine and interpret and use AI to make sure people stay on the right track and balanced, the better the outcome's going to be. And that's why heading towards homeostasis is going to be our pursuit together. And homeostasis means everyone has a say in their own way. So let's all make sure we listen to each other and hear maybe we could criticize pieces of it and tell people where their truth might be and what they're saying. So that's kind of all I want to address on tier 1 through 10, 2 through 10 right now. I've went over 11 already, which is just, the video should be titled tier 8. And I might just leave it as that. But these are still a work in progress. But I really think this is important because these synthesis tiers are the whole reason we have a left hemisphere. Like, if you can think about it, if all these tiers didn't exist, why would we think about them at all? Like, there's no reason to. But fundamentally, the right hemisphere perceives the way the world is even without these. So the world existed. That's why I think the right hemisphere existed first, because it needed to understand the way the world works in the entire environment. And then the left hemisphere was like always lagging behind slightly. And then as our society became more rationalistic, we had the Enlightenment, all these other things, our left hemisphere started growing and our right hemisphere started shrinking. So I'm expecting, like, if you did brain scans of everybody currently, we'd probably see a little bit larger left hemisphere than right hemisphere, or more gray matter or white matter or something along those lines. But if you go way back in time, and if you were able to take skulls of people, or like brains of people from back then, or like 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, you'd probably see the opposite. And I think that's a bad thing. I think it's detrimental for them way back then to not understand science yet. And that's what Aristotle was trying to articulate to them, is that here's this whole other perspective you guys are ignoring. And the Greeks, philosophers, and all those other people, is that there's this whole other side of the way the world works through observation instead of just intuition, the way you feel, that we need to address. And then it completely took over because of how useful and how much utility and how much progress, you could say, it brought to our society. So it completely took over. But you have to remember where we came from. Like, this side of our brain understands the way reality actually works. And if you haven't read up on rationalizations and how they aren't true, they're representations of reality, that's how you're going to understand what a synthesis is. So a synthesis isn't necessarily itself a rationalization, but we create a rationalization of what it is and what it looks like and how to perceive it with our left hemisphere. So if you actually perceived reality, it would look weird. It would almost look like an acid trip or something that you're looking at. And that's why our left hemisphere developed the way it did. It had to re-represent reality in a way that was useful and beneficial. So our left hemisphere kind of dominated our perception ability, even though the way our perception works is like everything to the left of your field of view goes to your right brain, and everything to the right of your field of view goes to your left brain. But it's still the case that in order to process everything around us, like, we're not processing true dichotomies when we look around. We're processing syntheses. So when I look at the sun, I guess you see photons. I guess that's kind of wrong, but you see the synthesis of the sun, which is made of atoms. And you're seeing the light from it. So you're processing the true dichotomy of light. But in the end, what you are processing is the atoms and the molecules and them interacting with light. So when they interact with light a certain way, you see them differently. So light is what's manifesting our vision of everything around us when it comes to vision. And I recommend you guys go look at if you want to read this, you can go look at my perceptions portion of it, and it's more well thought out, because I'm not as good at articulating some of these ideas just like without thinking about them or writing. It's a lot harder to speak about them for a long time, but in the end, like, that's what synthesis tiers are. So they can happen syntheses can happen within a tier, and they can happen to move it to the next tier. So a synthesis isn't just the tier. It's that when a tier of a synthesis happens, you are at a new stage of reality, or a new stage towards our pursuit of what God has designated and assigned us for. So he wants us to pursue this AI endeavor, and this biological endeavor, and this, like, all these endeavors, but we have to make sure that we are doing it in the service of our relationships. We have to make sure we don't lose our relationship to everything around us, all the life, all the beings, and we maintain love and cooperation. And I think, honestly, the AI integration is going to help with that, because it's it's going to show people other perspectives throughout their lives. But as long as it's in pursuit of that as well. So as long as we're designing AI that doesn't revolve around rationalizations and instead tries to teach people about both meaning and rationalizations, or syntheses in science, then I think we'll all live a better life and everything will be better for a lot of people. So that kind of concludes our lesson on the tiers of synthesis. And it's interesting. I don't know why nobody's ever looked at it this way. Like, it makes sense to me intuitively that you would combine each of these at all the way down. Like we consist of every one of these tiers all the way down to tier 0. But that doesn't mean we are God. That means God is within us, part of us. So we are part of God. Like, it's a little chunky piece. Like, obviously he's the whole picture, but we're just the little tiny piece. So yeah, and you can read just the rest of it, but that's more or less what I wanted to go over in this. So this is tier 2 through 10 of the syntheses. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Love you. Have a good night.